that by the late, thank you.
In case you were wondering.
So by the late 1980s, most of the eastern seaboard and Gulf coasts, as well as the Great Lakes region, had excessive deer densities that were causing problems for everything from farmers to local, lawns and landscapes, as well as our forest environments and other habitats. And this has been documented pretty effectively at really large scales recently by the U.S. Forest Service. So the central image there indicates that from this one study from the U.S. Forest Service, they found that the highest levels of deer browse were occurring in the mid-Atlantic region. About 80% of our forests have moderate to severe levels of browse. And that's translating on the bottom right into a more recent study where they found the majority of our forests in this region suffer from regeneration deficits, where there's not enough young trees in the understory to replace the older trees as they eventually die and meet the end of their lives. So that's really alarming. And you can see most of New Jersey is in that category, along with surrounding regions, all of which are experiencing similar levels of deer densities and deer browse. We've been doing some research at the college since 2013, documenting forest conditions throughout northern New Jersey by following up on Rutgers research that's been going on since the 1940s. So by revisiting sites that were studied by Rutgers researchers, we found that really severe levels of not just tree regeneration deficits were occurring, but also other vegetation in the understories. So native shrubs were declining, native herbaceous vegetation like wildflowers and forest grasses were declining, and native woody vines, which are referred to as lianas, are declining as well. So the gray bars indicate the Rutgers research from 1947 to 73 approximately, and the green bars indicate our revisits to those same sites in the past 10 years or so. Through a variety of other research, we were basically able to confirm that deer browse was the primary reason why this was happening. It's not the only reason, but you can see that the most severe deficits in tree regeneration are occurring in the large seedling size classes and the saplings. The large seedlings being the most vulnerable because they're accessible to deer, and they stay in that vulnerable state for multiple years until they can get large enough for that the deer no longer can eat them.
How large do they need to be?
Well, that size class is trees that are over a foot tall and less than an inch in diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet above the ground. So as long as the foliage is within the deer browse range, which is up to about 4.5 feet, they're most vulnerable. But even after their leaves are taller than that, they're still vulnerable to buck rub and other less severe impacts. Yeah, that's not as significant as direct browse damage. But the reasons why you see the even larger trees in the sapling size class, 1 to 4 inches in diameter, which could be a 20-foot tall tree, is that basically as those trees grow up, there aren't enough large seedlings to replace them. And so the trends basically are alarming, because if these trends continue as our trees begin to die off, and they're doing so in larger and larger numbers, there aren't enough saplings any longer to replace them either. And this is again because for 40, 50 years now, we've had too many deer in this region to support or to allow for tree regeneration to occur. It's not just deficits in the numbers of trees, but they're also changing the composition of our forests. So deer prefer to eat some species more than others. So the tastiest species like oaks and hemlocks and dogwoods are getting browsed the most. The species that are that have defenses against deer, like secondary compounds that are repellent to deer, like birches, beeches, and a few other species, fare better under browse pressure. And so we're seeing shifts in species dominance. So those two middle blocks of bars there indicate past and present comparisons like we saw in the previous slide. You can see major increases in the dark green bars that indicates that the species that are the most browse resistant are increasing in their proportions to the greatest degree. So we're seeing shifts from oak-dominated forests, for example, to birch-dominated forests. And there's multiple reasons, again, why that's happening, but deer are clearly a major factor. When deer densities get really high, we're starting to see not just a shift in tree species, native tree species, but basically the deer will eat any native species, and only invasives are able to grow at that point. So you can go to places like that photo there is from Chimney Rock up in Washington Valley Park in Somerset County. There's a light gap there. That should be chock full of native trees growing up in that light that the canopy gap created. But instead, all you see is Japanese angelica tree with the red berries at the top there, you can see in the light. Beneath that, you see Japanese wineberry.
Is there a way to get rid of that bar at the top?
I don't think for us, but I think the folks online don't see it perhaps.
Is that gonna go away now, do you think? No, I'm sorry, it's just blocking your words. You could try it.
Then they won't see the words at the bottom.
Yeah.
A little better. So, and when you compound this with tree mortality from invasive pests and diseases like emerald ash borer, now we've got multiple species attacking our beech trees. We have, going back 100 years to the chestnuts being wiped out by chestnut blight. The more of our dominant trees die out, and you've got understories filled with nothing but essentially invasive shrubs, we're losing our forest because there's no trees to replace those canopies as they die out. This is especially common in post-agricultural forests where you tend to have lower tree diversity and species like ashes dominating the canopy. So this is an all too familiar landscape in this region today as a result of the combination of these factors. And we're going to be seeing this at larger and larger scales as more and more pests and diseases are introduced and deer populations are maintained at these really high levels.
Still show baby trees as well.
It competes with them, yeah. So it can reduce their growth or survival for sure.
Yeah, it's every.
Maybe eventually they will, but usually it's not until it's the last thing left. Yeah. All right, now it's freezing on me. Didn't like that I moved it.
Maybe unshare and then reshare again.
Maybe if something's just like, what is this part on here?
That's just the microphone.
Okay.
I would stop share and reshare again. Is it like pulled up? Like would be hard to reshare?
No.
Yeah, try that.
Okay.
When in doubt, turn it off and turn it back on.
So we want here? No, it's this one.
Yeah.
Where's this?
Then do this arrow. Then or that. Now see if
This
yep,
back
you can put that
down.
down. And then
This
see if-
back over. Still not working.
Well.
Hey, okay, I just gotta
Oh.
click the screen. Okay.
Oh.
All right, so other changes that have taken place since the mid-20th century in our forests, or we're seeing a dramatic rise in invasive plant species in understory, like Japanese stiltgrass, for example. In the mid-20th century, most of our species were native, indicated by the green bars there. Now it's roughly half and half native and invasive species. And if you look at the two data sets during the past time frame, you can see that the most common invasives today were really occurring at very low numbers for the most part. Now they can be as high as 95% cover in the understories of these forests, and a whole host of additional species have appeared in the forest as well. And those numbers increase as more and more exotic species are introduced into our landscapes. And that's from the old growth forest, the primary forests that have no history of agriculture. So that's at the top of this slide here. We also have a large amount of forests in our area that have a history of agricultural use, but have returned back into forests. And that history of soil disturbance also favors the growth of invasive plant species. So in those post-agricultural forests, you see the invasive species far outnumber the native species. And so we're seeing a radical transformation of our forests from primarily native dominated ecosystems that have existed for thousands of years to something that has never occurred here or anywhere else on the planet for that matter, with all kinds of really complicated effects on the species that depend on those plants for survival.
Yep, insider tip. Go to more. Hide.
Still have to click the screen though. Now this isn't working? Okay. All right, so the combination of deer with these land use effects leads to basically additive effects combined that tend to go in the same direction. So the top three bars there, you can see reductions in tree seedlings, both small and large seedlings, as well as the saplings that we saw in earlier slides. You can see the native herbs and shrubs are declining on balance, and invasive species are all increasing dramatically. because both deer and history of soil disturbance are favoring them in the same direction.
Fine term for previous agricultural lands, within 50 years, within 25 years.
So when we did this, we had records going back to the late 1800s, and it was consistent across the board. So whether the forest or the farm was abandoned in the 70s, or before the 1930s aerials were taken, or before the Vermeule maps in the 1800s were created, you see the same results basically. Good question. So the declines in tree regeneration, which is the focus of some of the work that I've been doing with the Sourland Conservancy, in this case is a combination of deer, and the orange parts, the post-ag effects, are due both to competition with invasive species like we talked about. These, forests full of invasives are outcompeting our native trees, which is making the situation worse, shading them out or crowding them out. And then on top of all that, you've got this history of soil disturbance that's also impacting them. For example, in those post-ag forests, there was 50% less organic matter in the soil, carbon in the soil, than in post or primary forests with no history of agriculture, because the history of tillage and other effects from agricultural use. All right, so what to do about all this? There's lots of things that you can do to try to restore forests. One of the strategies is planting trees, whether it's in open fields to try to reforest areas, or along stream buffers to try to, improve water quality along stream corridors, or in forest environments where you've got deficits of young trees in the understory that are needed to replace those older trees as they die. Since we have this historic data set that was collected prior to deer populations and invasive plant species taken off, we know how many trees should be there. And in that large seedling size class, it amounts to a deficit of about 2,500 large seedlings per acre. So that's a lot of planting to do to compensate for what the deer and these other factors are causing in our forests.
So that's built with the expectation that some.
Most of them will end up dying just from natural mortality.
It looks so dense that you wonder how they can compete with each other, but you're saying you're gonna lose some.
So when I show you so this is in the fall after the leaves have fallen off of most of the trees here in the understory. I have some photos later on where you can see what it looks like in the summer. And in these primary forest conditions, there's usually a fairly large number of young trees that are less than a foot tall. That's far denser than what you see those tubes look like in this case. So the Sourland Conservancy, as you heard, and I'm sure you already know, is a leader in this area. They've been doing extraordinary work planting trees all over the place. This is from their website, so it's a little outdated. At this point, they had 46 or so thousand trees and shrubs planted, and now it's up to 57,000. And so they invited us to take a look at the work they were doing. They escorted us around to some of their planting sites. And, we're very generous in inviting us in to just collect some data and contribute some science to monitor the results and the effects, and maybe fine tune it to get better results in the future based on that work. So we started collecting data on the survival and growth of trees at a number of sites in 2021, I believe. Yeah. The two sites that we picked, just kind of by chance, were the Wusamansa Preserve and Rainbow Hill Preserve, that are managed by Phobos and New Jersey Conservation Foundation. The three things that we were interested in looking at were the differences in the success of the plantings in those primary forests compared to the post-agricultural forests, because there's different things going on in those two kinds of forest environments. Whether the tubes were making a difference to improve the survival and growth of trees, or potentially counterproductive because you're changing the microclimate that the trees are growing in. There's been some observations that, for example, over the wintertime, rodents like to get in there and benefit from that cozy environment and can actually cause damage to the trees as a result. So it's an open question whether the tubes actually on balance do good or harm. And then comparing the planted trees versus naturally regenerating trees. Yes, sir. So the question was, in case you didn't hear that, for those of you online, whether we also looked at exclosures or cages, which are other strategies that the Sourland Conservancy has been using. We did collect data on exclosures, and we're hoping to test more of those factors here. But over the past year of going through the data and doing some quality control, it was unfortunately the case that those other questions were not going to be answerable because some of the interns did not properly collect or label the data or the trees in the field. So a lot of that data was lost. And so we were basically only able to provide data to answer to some degree these questions at this point, which was heartbreaking because it was years worth of work and we were too slow to find those errors to recover from it. In the end, we measured 640 trees. Each year we go to the same trees. We had them tagged. We tagged a certain number that were planted and tubed, a certain number that were naturally growing, and we put tubes around them we tried to get trees that were roughly the same size and same diversity of trees. And then we also tagged some trees that were naturally growing and left them untubed to see what the general survival of trees was without those protections. And when we went out in 3 consecutive years, so the first year was just the baseline, and the second 2 years show us the first 2 years of survival and growth. The results were kind of surprising to me. The survival data, basically the red lines indicate the controls, no tubes around the trees. These are naturally growing trees with no protections. The green is a natural growing tree with a tube put around it, and blue is the planted trees. So you can see that in both situations, the planted trees with tubes survive better. Statistically, it's not actually significant. So it's about a 10% difference on average, but statistically it's a wash. So there is no significant improvement. But even just looking at these figures, it's interesting that the naturally growing trees, when a tube is put around them, they don't seem to fare as well, which means that there's maybe some kind of impact. Maybe they don't like being crammed into a tube after having grown in the open sun for a while. That's a possibility. Maybe there's some other factors too. It's also interesting that you see the same amount of survival as trees with no tubes at all. So the deer are munching these things year after year, and we're seeing the same amount of mortality as the trees with the tubes put around them, which is surprising. We thought the red line would go off a cliff and the other two would be more steady, but that didn't turn out to be the case. So there does seem to be some sort of potential negative impact to placing the tubes around trees. The planted trees appear to fare a little bit better, but statistically that doesn't stand out. Growth of the trees. So in the top 2 figures, you see the same kind of chart. On the left side is post-ag forest and the right side is primary. This is just looking at the actual height of trees. And what you can see here is the blue lines, the planted trees again stand out. And that shows us that the starting height of those trees was larger than the trees that we put tubes around or the naturally growing trees around them. And that could be, again, one factor why there's greater survival in those trees, because some of the research in the literature suggests that when trees are a little bit larger, they have more energy reserves, they're a little bit hardier, and they can survive better. So that could be one of the possible explanations for this little bit of bump in survival that they get compared to the natural trees. If you even the score by basically looking at percent growth, so it doesn't matter what your height is, it's how much you grow relative to where you started at the baseline, you can see that it pretty much evens out. In the post-ag forests, the planted trees grow at essentially the same rates as the naturally growing trees with tubes, and slightly lower growth in the end by the trees that have no tubes that are growing naturally with no protections. In the primary forests, we see actually much lower growth rates of the planted trees with tubes, which again is interesting. There's a lot of reasons why that might occur. When you're planting a tree into a new environment, you're disturbing the soil, and maybe there's a negative impact that comes from that. We're planting trees into a shadier environment in this primary forest, and that's one thing I forgot to mention. The post-ag forest that's here, it's also along the edge of the forest. There's a lot more light coming in, and that's also probably why we see greater growth rates in the post-ag environment compared to the primary forest environment. More light means more tree growth. But in the primary forest where there's more shade, the naturally growing seedlings with or without tubes seem to grow at greater rates than the planted trees with tubes on them. So with this very limited data, 2 sites, I mean, it's a couple hundred trees that we looked at, which is a significant amount of measurements, but it's only 2 sites as opposed to the hundreds that have been planted across the Sourlands. The gist of it suggests that survival on average was higher in the primary forest, probably because the soil quality is better. There's more healthier soil with more carbon, supporting more forest growth. It's less stressful because there's less light impacting trees that are going to make them less vulnerable to drought, for example, which we had during this time period. Growth was greater in the post-ag forest, probably because of the enhanced light. And if you planted them even farther away from the edge out in the open, like we've seen on our campus, you could get really skyrocketing levels of growth, especially for fast-growing trees like tulip poplars and sycamores. Other species are more naturally slow growing. As far as the effects of the tubes and planting versus natural seed production occurring from the forests on their own, survival, again, was not significantly greater with or without tubes. The planted trees seemed to fare a little bit better. And there did seem to be an overall negative effect from placing the tubes that impacted tree survival. Growth was significantly lower for planted trees than natural seedlings in the primary forest, but roughly equivalent in the post-ag forests. So all this combined suggests, and I'll get to you in a second, it kind of raises questions whether the plantings make sense, especially in the primary forest environment where there's abundant seedlings already, and protecting them seems to result in similar levels of survival and greater levels of growth. In the post-ag forest where there's more light, it appears to be a wash. There does still seem to be a negative effect of the tubes. And so that's where it might make sense to, and we tried this, collect data on cages or exclosures so that you don't have that microclimate effect that could be leading to more rodent damage or other compounding factors that we weren't able to pinpoint. Good question.
On your natural seedlings, are you looking at reporting whether there's any evidence of previous browse?
We did. Yeah, we did. So the problem is that it's difficult to identify historic browse conclusively. There's ways to do it, but it takes a trained eye, and our interns proved to be uneven in their effectiveness. So I didn't analyze that data fully yet, and I'm uncertain about it in general. There was browse occurring with or without tubes. So even with a full-size tube protecting a much smaller tree inside, we saw browse, even fresh browse occurring in those environments. But many of these trees, like you can see here, sorry, the smaller trees, is there a cursor? No, oh, there we go. So these smaller trees that are about 25 centimeters tall, many of them are being browsed to that height by the deer, and they don't die necessarily right away. They can live for a couple of years, and they look like little pruned bonsai trees in some cases. So you could definitely see in severe cases where of multiple years of browse, there's repeated pruning, and the orientation of the buds provides a pretty good indicator of the history of browse. But again, it's something you have to look carefully at, and our students didn't do an equal job at identifying that. So it's a fuzzier data set. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about whether less severe non-bonsai cases where they have been browsed, that seedling may have a much more established root system that might explain why it takes off better than one.
That's an interesting question. The other complicating factor to the first question you asked is that, and sorry for the people online, the question is, did we measure browse, and can you measure past levels of browse? And that's what I was attempting to answer. You don't necessarily know the cause of the browse that occurred. It could have been vegetation damage. It could have been mechanical damage. Maybe something just knocked into it and killed the apical, bud. It could have been a disease and not deer that led to like the death of that part of the stem. So it's complicated. And that's partly why I didn't present it or put too much weight into the analysis, at least at this early stage. We do have a fourth year of data collected that it took me so long to clean up this data and deal with the problems that I was referring to that this is as far as I got. But we do have another year of data to add to this, and maybe the story will change. Maybe it will continue in the same direction. And then this year's data has yet to be collected. So it raises a question, and I think instead is probably the wrong word, because there's all kinds of values for tree plantings. In some contexts, they clearly make sense, especially when you're trying to reforest an area or enhance a riparian buffer, for example. In forest environments where the trees are reproducing actively and the soil is healthy, the data that we collected seems to suggest that it might make sense to focus efforts in other ways to improve regeneration, like aggressive deer management, which isn't as appealing to a lot of people. It's a lot more fun to plant trees, feels great, and there's all kinds of reasons to do that, even if it doesn't result in forest restoration success. It's good for people to get engaged and to connect with these issues. But when we've got trees, and I'm not saying that this is the case for the Sourland Conservancy, but a lot of restoration efforts bring in trees from foreign sources, from like North Carolina or Michigan, and those are other countries. They don't necessarily have the same genotypes as our trees here and may not be as well adapted to the forests or the soils that we have here. You're disrupting the soil, you're enhancing soil disturbance, and that can be contributing negatively to the forest understory. So in primary forests, I think it appears that other strategies should likely be pursued besides tree planting, like deer management. And if you think just as a question of scale, if we have deficits of 2,500 seedlings per acre in these forests, replanting the Sourlands, how many acres is it? That's a lot of planting and time and money and energy, when it seems like you'd get better returns and save a lot of time and money and energy by working with natural systems and natural processes in different ways. In the post-ag forest, they're a wreck. And there's a lot of situations that might lead to better results. We studied one site, so I don't want to put too much weight into these conclusions or this data. It's an interesting data set that I think leads to some further questions and is worth looking further into. But the jury's out, I think, on the results and the feasibility of doing this at scale to support restoration in the Sourlands, at least in the primary forest, but probably also in the post-ag forests. So that's as far as I got with my part of the data set. And if you can, yes, okay.
Have you considered a native wildflower meadow as the primary ground cover to allow succession? And then the second part was, is there an advantage for aggressive, diverse plantings of trees, including successional?
So we didn't study any old fields in this case. We've worked in Reddington and other places where we've been working on meadow management with them, and that is the targets for management for a number of meadows there. But the short of it is that, yes, you can do both of those things. Meadow environments are valuable in their own right, though, for pollinators and for all kinds of other grassland birds, for example. So whether you want to shift them into forests and reforest them, it can be a little bit tricky, and it depends on the context and how much other kinds of habitats might be in the vicinity. In terms of how, if you decide you want to turn that meadow into a forest, then you can work with the same sorts of processes. Birds are going to be dropping seeds, wind is going to blow seeds in. If you walk in any grassland, you will find tree seedlings growing there, and you can protect them in the same sort of way. They're going to be competing with the grasses, and so there might be other measures you need to take to kind of beat back the competitive influence of the grasses, but you also have the advantage of growing in open sunlight, which is going to favor faster tree growth. So you can use similar sorts of techniques. It might make more sense because of the competition with grasses to plant some larger trees that are above the canopy of the grasses and are just going to take off from there. But it depends. So yeah, and if you were in those situations, the two kind of strategies for doing it are picking trees that grow fast in those kinds of environments that are going to get there anyway, but maybe plant them in a little bit larger stage of growth. Usually the first trees to arrive are wind and bird dispersed trees. So it'd be like cherries and ashes and maples. But we also have problems with regeneration of oak forest. We're losing our oak forest largely because of deer and other factors. And so some people want to kind of just skip that whole step, like the early stages of successional growth in forests and all the things that are going to get there on their own, and push them towards the species that are going to have the hardest time getting there, that are the slowest to disperse. So, like an hickory or an oak nut is going to take a lot longer to travel, a couple hundred yards from the closest forest patch than a wind-blown seed or a bird's dispersing it. So some people are instead trying to skip that early successional stage and go right for the mid or late successional stages and just plant oaks and hickories and see what you get. So there's all kinds of approaches to it. That wasn't part of our work in this study, but all those things definitely are possible.
picking the same species of trees as your controls, or?
We tried to pick the same tree. So the trees that were picked for the forest for planting, we didn't choose those things. They were already planted and we just came and collected data on them. But they were picked in consultation with a number of local biologists, and they were generally consistent with the trees that were growing there. So we tried to pick a similar diversity and number of trees as were planted. There were a couple oddballs that ended up getting protected, and some oddballs that probably shouldn't have been planted where they were, like sweet gums in a dry forest environment, for example. But for the most part, it was appropriate plantings, and we were able to find comparable native species. And that's one other level of analysis that I haven't gotten into yet, is breaking the growth and survival down by species. It may very well be the case that some species fared much better than others, and that's not going to jump out at us in the data set when everything's averaged out together. So that is another level of analysis that I plan to get to, but got bogged down in the QA QC stuff that prevented me from doing that so far.
Did any of the replantings include ash trees, or is the expectation
I don't think so.
they're not gonna, with the emerald ash borer, those are just done?
Yeah, I don't recall the full species list off the top of my head, but I don't remember ashes being part of that. You have a question?
Yeah, would you expect to have access to some type of like large scale tools like for other like topics, we use like leaders, for example, to like scan the forest canopy and see at a very, very minute level how much growth you have and what is the evolution of different like parcels. So could you do the same thing, or you don't have access to that type of tools?
Well, and you're talking about to measure the planting growth of the plantings. So the problem is, if you look at the sizes here, it took 3 years for even the largest trees to get up above the level of the tubes. So if you use LiDAR, you'd basically be measuring tubes, because the trees are somewhere inside of those. And so it'd be, I think, processing LiDAR data is challenging enough, but then trying to locate the tubes and then look inside them would be, like, I think, even more difficult, especially if you're just looking at a single stem sticking out of it at a less than centimeter scale. Sifting through the noise in the LiDAR data to get inside that tube, I would imagine would be really challenging, if not impossible overall, but maybe I'm wrong.
Natural regeneration, like in the fences that are adjacent to some of these planting sites, would that be more effective than trying to go around and count all the 2,500 trees that are growing naturally in those spaces?
Yes, and there's different ways to do it. We've been partnering with Dr. Gallagher and the U.S. Forest Service at this Silas Little Research Station. They have ground-based LiDAR systems that sit on tripods, and you scan the forest understory below the canopy, because that's ultimately a problem. If you're flying over in an aircraft with a LiDAR mounted to it, the canopy is going to block a lot of what the lasers can pick up. It can get through there, but that just is more noise to filter out. So they have these tripod mounted LiDAR scanners, and LiDAR is laser scanning devices, basically, if you're not familiar with it. That creates like a 3D scan, and you can sift through that to get stem densities and foliage densities and all kinds of things. So the Forest Service lent us one of those devices, and we used that a couple years prior to this to look at some of our studies in deer exposures at Duke Farms and in Redington. But they have similar problems with the processing of the data. You get dozens and dozens of variables that the LiDAR can give you information on, and figuring out which are the important ones that tell you something useful and which ones don't is something that they're working on because it's a new technology and they're trying to test it out. The short answer is yes, you can use those technologies. Whether it ends up being faster or more efficient than the classical traditional ways of doing it remains to be seen, but it seems like there's a lot of potential there, at least, especially as the technologies improve and the codes and computer-based processing and filtering devices that we need to make sense of the data that it collects are created to allow more user-friendly interfaces for us humans to be able to use those things effectively. Was there another question over here? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, if anything about longer term ability to increase the grown-up students, other places that have been long enough to
That's a good question. I haven't looked at the literature to sift through all that yet. But I think that's really important. I mean, we're investing a lot of public dollars, not just the Sourland Conservancy, but billions of trees being planted around the world to try to combat climate change. A lot of that work is being really thoughtfully done and likely really effective, but there's also lots of cases where that's not the case. And in some cases, the wrong trees are being planted and it's causing problems as a result. There were some studies a couple of years ago that came out in The Guardian, for example, that were highlighting some of those efforts in parts of the Middle East and Africa. So I think that's important research to do. That's beyond the scope of what we're attempting to get at here, but I haven't looked at the literature yet to be able to answer those questions myself. But really important questions. Yeah. The height for what? I think the idea is to get up above the browse level that the deer are going to be impacting. So that the deer can just stick their faces right in like a snow cone. Sorry. No, it's not a bad idea. But the problem is we don't know, we didn't look at what were the causes of the mortality in the tubes. It would take some really careful observations to figure out why those trees in the tubes were not surviving better than the ones without tubes. Is it rodents? Is it microclimate? Is it diseases? You know, I think it was 2023 that was a really bad drought. Maybe it was the year before. It was a really intense drought that summer. Maybe those things were like solar ovens. I really don't know. We didn't measure the microclimate. So that's a good question. If it was microclimate, then yeah, a smaller tube might make more sense. But it might make even more sense to just put a cage where you don't have to worry about it. So yeah, I think alternatives are worth exploring, and that's already being done. We just, our data didn't pan out to help us answer those questions with this project, unfortunately.
General question. You know, the forest search is like 500 cage tree. So it's not anything. Like,
Yeah, well, how long have they been caged? 5 years? That's good. So I think for a lot of trees, especially in a shaded environment, it's going to take about 5 years before you really do start to see some of that growth where they're getting above the browse line. And we know that from looking at deer exclosures. It's just like 3 to 5 years where you really start to see visible effects. And after 5 to 12 years, you see like, you know, really dense understory growth. But so either way, it's a long-term venture. We've got, you know, 2 years of follow-up data that we've presented, which is why I don't want to put too much weight into this. It's a limited data.
But I'm wondering if we're at some point out. Well, what is the survivability to tree? What are you seeing now? Yeah, but
Well, we're looking at for these two forests, the tube trees were anywhere from about 65% survival to up to 85% survival after 2 years. It's pretty good, except that it's about the same as the trees with no tubes, which
no,
I'm surprised that those trees lasted as long as they did. I thought that the trees with no tubes would have fallen off the map because the deer density at Rainbow Hill in particular is over 100 deer per square mile. If you get above 15 deer per square mile, it impacts tree regeneration. So it's amazing that those trees survived at all. But maybe they're getting browsed and just growing back like we talked about earlier, and that's what's happening there. Yeah. No, because we definitely flagged a lot of oaks and tasty species, dogwoods and things. We made sure to do that. But again, I have to get into the species level data to be able to answer some of those questions. All right, we got limited time. Let's save the questions to the end because this is going to eat it all the time up for the evening, and we've got more to talk about here. So thank you for your interest, and we'll talk more about it.
All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about the water quality piece of this, which you'll see in a moment has some tie-ins to what Jay was talking about, particularly in a comparison of the primary and post-agricultural forest. But we'll get there. first, a little bit of background. I feel like probably this audience is pretty hip to most of this stuff. So we'll work through this fairly quickly, but please stop me at any point if you have questions. So of course, we're interested in asking questions about water quality because we want to support healthy communities of aquatic organisms in our water bodies. And of course, we want our water bodies to be safe for us to drink, both in terms of surface water and groundwater. And also, as we see in the bottom photo there, that poor water quality is an indicator of what's happening on land, right? And it always goes back to land management practices and how we're treating the land. So it can be a good red flag of what we're not doing correctly. And so in an area like central New Jersey, including the Sourland region, these are the kinds of problems that we see. I think most people are familiar with the pollutant story that we see on the left. And increasingly, we're becoming concerned about road salt applications in the winter. But we have to think about a whole range of pollutants from stormwater in our urbanized environment, from agriculture and from industry. And of course, we're also thinking about emerging contaminants like micro and nanoplastics, as well as PFAS. But I think also what often gets overlooked is just the physical impact of stormwater, not even the pollutant side of things. So in that middle photo there and the photo on the right, we see that during rain events, and we're getting more intense rain events more frequently because of climate change, that we're getting higher and higher storm flows coming off of our paved surfaces and hitting our streams within minutes or hours of that rain event occurring, which in a natural drainage landscape, that would be occurring via soil infiltration to groundwater. That would take days, weeks, months, years for that water to hit the stream. So that's causing these massive erosive issues. And so what's the upshot of that? So we see down there the bullet points from both pollutants and stream bank erosion issues, reduced habitat conditions for the aquatic communities. All that erosion, that sediment's going to end up depositing into the bottom of the streams. That's where the organisms are living that support fish and bird communities. And so we see reduced diversity and abundance of organisms. These are two of my interns here on the right, one of whom is in the audience today, and they are installing erosion pins on the stream. Actually, this is not a stream in the Sourlands, this is the stream on the RVCC campus, but we're looking for cheap, intern-friendly ways to measure these erosion processes. Okay, did I skip one? No, I'm good. Okay. So this is leading me to ask some questions, some research questions. And this is the question that I was kind of trying to pair with Jay's study here. So I'm asking, does water quality differ in streams that drain post-agricultural forests compared with streams that drain intact or primary forests? Okay, so we're thinking about that land use history piece. And do we see this continued signature from agriculture even after a forest has regenerated? And so my prediction is that nutrient concentrations would be higher in streams that drain post-agricultural forests. Now, you might be wondering, why focus on nutrient concentrations? Why not some other pollutant? And I think there are a few good reasons why nutrients are a really good indicator of what's happening in our water bodies and what's happening on land. A great thing about nutrients is we know where they come from. Now, it's a little bit hard to study that in a given stream. If you find some elevated nutrients, you don't necessarily know exactly where it comes from. But broadly speaking, collectively, we know where the nutrients are coming from. They're coming from fertilizers and agricultural and residential landscapes. They're coming from wastewater treatment plants, from leaky septic systems, and from overabundant wildlife like deer and geese. And we know the effects of these nutrients on our landscape. So the top two photographs here on the right are showing harmful algal bloom conditions. This is in an estuary landscape. This is not local. That's out in San Diego. But actually, these photos here on the right are from New Jersey. That's from DEP's harmful algal bloom website. And so Harmful algal bloom is somewhat of a misnomer. Most of the time, this is coming from cyanobacteria, and that's what we see in that bottom, or sorry, the top right. But also on the bottom right, we do also see non-harmful species that can bloom under these excess nutrient conditions. So they're not harmful in the sense that they don't produce the neurotoxins that could affect wildlife or pets that get into these water bodies or potentially drinking water sources. But they are certainly still having an ecological impact on those water bodies by blooming to these massive abundances. And when these massive blooms occur, they're dynamic. They can't maintain those massive population growth for that long. Eventually they crash, and all that biomass decomposes, and that consumes a lot of oxygen in the water column, which can lead to the fish kills that you see on the other photos. So this is the reason we're concerned about nutrients. The other great thing about nutrients is we know how to measure them. We have very good techniques for doing that. We have regulatory limits for them in drinking water and in surface water. And we know what the impacts are, human health impacts are of elevated nutrients when we consume them in our drinking water. So lots of good reasons to think about nutrients. There are plenty of other pollutants that one could measure. This happens to be one that I know how to measure. Okay, so I chose 6 sampling locations, 6 different streams through the Sourland region. Of course, you can see the region here, right? Here's the ridge that's less developed, nicely well preserved. But of course, along that ridge on both sides, you have the foothills of the Sourlands, which have more of that agricultural history. It doesn't mean that there weren't any human land uses on the ridge. There certainly would have been a lot of timber extraction, certainly would have been pasturing and other kinds of activities, but less agricultural land use on the ridges. So I chose 3 sites that were that are in watersheds with intact forest, and you can see those with the green pins there. So one in the Sourland Mountain Preserve in Somerset County, one at Zion Crossing in Montgomery, and one at the Sourland Mountain Preserve in Hunterdon County, that's in East Amwell. And then the 3 yellow pins that you see are streams that I selected in watersheds that drain post-agricultural forests. So that's Otto's Farm in Hillsborough and Cedar Ridge and Moores Creek, both in Hopewell Township. How did I determine which sites were primary forest versus post-agricultural? So I looked at 1930s aerial photos using Conservation Blueprint, for those of you familiar with that resource. So the top 2, I believe that's oh, now I'm going to forget, but I think it's the Sourland Mountain Preserve in Somerset on the left and the one in Hunterdon on the right, I believe. And you can see where those blue pins are, that those were actually forested back in the 1930s. You can see the agricultural land use on either side of that ridge, but those particular watersheds that drained the streams that we're measuring were forested back in the 1930s. So at least 100 years worth of forest. Versus Moores Creek on the bottom left, and I believe that's Otto's Farm on the bottom right. You can see those were fully agricultural watersheds in the 1930s. So we, meaning my lovely interns that you see pictured here, they collected samples on a bi-week basis from these 6 streams in the 2 collection periods that you see listed here. That included winter conditions. So we had sampling through the seasons. And so the interns collected the bottles, collected the samples in the bottles in the field and transported them back to the water quality lab at RBCC. That's the water quality lab there, pictured. Back at the lab, the student interns filtered the samples to remove large particles, and then we froze those samples. We batched them for analysis. So basically, we analyzed the samples on this instrument here. This is called a flow injection analyzer. You always have to anthropomorphize these instruments, so they need the googly eyes and they need names. This one is Lady Latchet. Latchet is the name of the model of machine. So in the bottom right, you see pictured the interns running hundreds of samples in a day to analyze those samples for nitrate and ammonium concentrations. I'm just going to show you the nitrate data, partly because it's more interesting, but partly because nitrate is the nutrient that's more mobile in the environment. So it's more likely to be washed out during a rain event, washed through the soil, and make its way into the groundwater or streams. So here are some preliminary findings. Again, from nitrate concentrations. In the blue bar, you're seeing nitrate concentrations average across all the primary forest sites, across all the sampling dates, versus nitrate concentrations in the post-agricultural streams. So clearly, nitrate concentrations were much higher in the post-agricultural streams, as I predicted. And that difference is meaningful. But I will say that overall, the concentrations are still rather low, or at least the average concentrations are pretty low. This is much lower than anything that would spark any regulatory red flag. But that said, the post-agricultural nitrate concentrations are still higher than natural baseline levels that we would anticipate. But we do see that in the primary forest. That's nice background levels. That's good to see. If we dig a little deeper and do a site-by-site analysis, so you see the 3 intact forest sites on the left, and then the 3 post-agricultural sites on the right, you can see that the difference between post-ag and primary is really being driven by 2 sites, Morris Creek and Otto's Farm, and in particular, Otto's Farm. Interestingly, Cedar Ridge in yellow resembled the primary forest sites much more than the post-agricultural sites. So that's an interesting finding. And it leads to this question, okay, well, how are these post-agricultural sites different from each other? What could explain some of these differences? So if we look a little more closely, I'm showing you here photos of our 3 post-agricultural streams, Cedar Ridge on the left. So Cedar Ridge is the one that had the good nitrate levels, and then Otto's Farm and Morris Creek in the middle and on the right are the ones that had the higher levels. So one thing I notice when I look at these photos, and of course from anecdotally from being in the field at these locations, is that Cedar Ridge has a much healthier riparian buffer, has a wider buffer, a higher quality buffer, and it also has a longer history of protection than the other 2 sites. So that's a DNR Greenway Land Trust Preserve, one of the earliest sites that they preserved. Otto's Farm, you can see, has a pretty shrimpy riparian buffer, which is why the Sourland Conservancy is doing plantings there, and they're trying to work on that. And Morris Creek on one side has a pretty decent riparian buffer, but it's a little hard to tell in the photo, but here's a roadway right here. So it's very constrained. So compare this to our primary forest sites, all of which have excellent, high quality, wide riparian buffers. You're seeing Zion Crossing on the left and Sourland Mountain Preserve in Somerset County on the right. And so I think probably most of you know this story, but in terms of nutrients, why are riparian buffers so useful? So of course the native vegetation supports those stream banks, and it's going to prevent that erosion. It's going to prevent that sediment deposition that gets into the streams. But also importantly, the forest soils and the plants themselves take up nutrients. They will take up nutrients that are running off from the land. They'll take up nutrients from the groundwater. And the natural drainage in those areas is going to slow down those runoff processes. It's going to allow that runoff to infiltrate into any precipitation, to infiltrate into the soil, make its way to the groundwater, and release slowly to streams. The idea is to slow down all these processes to give the plants and the soil organisms time to take up the nutrients. So here's the question, right? So the Sourland Conservancy is doing this wonderful plantings at places like Otto's Farm. Will the tree planting at Otto's Farm bring down those nitrate concentrations? And it's a question that remains. We don't know the answer to that question. It could take some time. Yes, we absolutely want to encourage the planting of riparian buffers, but there is also sometimes a long signature of past agricultural land use. From the application of fertilizers over decades, excess nutrients get down into the groundwater, and that groundwater takes a very long time to make its way to the receiving streams. So even if you preserve, even if you turn agricultural land over into an old field and eventually into a forest, it could still take decades or even over a century for the excess nutrients in the groundwater to finally discharge to the stream. So it could be some time, even with excellent planting work and work to restore that buffer to bring down that green bar. It could still take a little time. So of course, in the meantime, what are other things that we could be doing? And a lot of these are things that individual homeowners could be doing in addition to the institutional work that organizations like the Watershed Institute and Sourland Conservancy are doing. So people should be maintaining septic systems, and they should be encouraged to do so. They should be encouraged to find ways to minimize or eliminate fertilizer applications on their own properties. Homeowners that have stream corridors on their property should be encouraged to maintain healthy riparian buffers and not mow up to the edge of the stream. Of course, we should be protecting and restoring existing forests in the way that Sourland Conservancy and other organizations are doing. If you're a homeowner maintaining a riparian buffer, that means you're going to have to remove invasive species, right, to get the best bang out of the buck of those riparian buffers. And then, of course, installing infiltration practices like rain gardens and rain barrels to find ways to reduce that stormwater runoff coming off these paved surfaces and allow that to naturally drain into the groundwater instead. These are all things that we could be doing to address the problem of excess nutrients. And I think that's what I had. So these are acknowledgements. We just wanted to thank our funding sources, in particular, the Gackstatter Foundation, in partnership with the Sourland Conservancy, as well as additional funding sources to support the stipends for our interns, multiple project partners, and of course, all the RBCC staff and student interns that were involved in collecting these data. And just to end on a note of, the Center for Environmental Studies at RBCC, if you want to find us, that's where our website lives, and you can find contact information for both Jay and myself there. And I will happily take any other questions you have about water quality, and of course, also questions for Jay. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a communication plan to send this information to send
Yeah. So the question is, do we have a communication plan? We don't have anything quite so sophisticated, but we certainly want to have additional conversations with Lori. This was our kind of first attempt to present some preliminary data and pull this together. It's not fully completed data analysis. We still have more that we want to do with the data. But yes, it's a conversation with our wonderful partner, talk about how to disseminate this information. But yes, thank you. Yeah.
And I'll pass this around to our question people so that are online.
Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, cute. So when you were doing your analysis of runoffs off of agricultural land, right? Nutrients off agricultural land, you're talking about farms. Did you analyze, or did you use in your analysis what was grown on that land? Because I would think hay doesn't have as much nutrient needs as soybeans.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously something else that's going to differ between these three post-agricultural streams is not just the riparian buffer quality, but it's going to be the history of agricultural land use. What did it look like? How long was it? How intensive was it? So that would be a next step in this study, would be to try to pull those historical records. I'm sure folks at the Sourland Conservancy have some knowledge of this. That was beyond the scope of my initial attempts, but yes, I would love to go in that direction. Absolutely. Yeah.
I have some questions from online here. Somebody wants to know, for water quality, do forbs do as well as trees in riparian zones?
I'm sorry, what does
Forbs.
what do as well as trees?
Forbs. F-O.
Forbs.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a question for our botanist. I think that was the question. Forbs. That means something else in this part of the world, yes.
Well, at filtering water quality, is that?
Is that the question? Do as well at filtering nutrients? I would suspect that trees, just quantity wise would do better, but that I'm not an expert in those kinds of questions, but yeah. could be.
And then, have there been positive results from settling structures from road runoff? That's,
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
have there been positive results from settling structures from road runoff? That's the whole question.
Settling structures? Oh, like stream bank stabilization structures?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say the data on that is pretty mixed. I didn't present any of that literature review. But there are definitely critiques of sort of the more engineered stream bank stabilization, like the cages, the rock riprap, that sort of thing. I think it's not as good of an option as native vegetation and restored stream banks. But in some places it is honestly the best that can be done until we really have a regional way to deal with stormwater.
Hi, I have a nutrient question since you seem to be into that a bit. We were in the harmful algae bloom team out of Montclair, and I know a lot of people are really concerned besides nitrate about phosphates,
Yes,
basically.
correct.
And phosphorus in the water from being a limiting factor. Are you doing any measuring of phosphorus? And if so, did you find a difference between that, or was so? You want to
Yeah.
talk about phosphorus a little bit?
No, that's great. I love the question. The question is, in terms of harmful algal blooms, we often think about phosphate more than nitrate because a lot of the cyanobacteria are nitrogen fixers. So it's the excess phosphate is more of a driver of harmful algal blooms than nitrate. My lab doesn't yet have the capacity to measure phosphate, but it's a methodology that we want to get up and running, and we hope to get up and running in the near future. But I need more interns. Yeah, would love to do that. Yeah.
Question. You talked about like primary forest, you talked about you using your 1930s aerial pictures.
Yes.
There's no GIS. There's no GIS layer available with that information that you could use.
So are you familiar with renewal forest map from the 1800s?
Do you want to come up and say this on mic?
So the oldest large-scale forest map for New Jersey was created by Vermeule in the late 1800s. It's a print map that was scanned by Rutgers and posted online as well as by the state. And the Crystal Lab at Rutgers, run by Rick Lathrop, created a digitized version of that map. And we did our analysis based on that. So I didn't mention the results of the analysis, but it was part of the same paper. So that image on the left there is the extent of the digitized GIS version of that Vermeule map, comparing forest cover in the late 1800s with forest cover in 2015. So places that were continuously forested between those time periods we were just considering primary forest with no record of agriculture, although it may have been very early on that it was farmed, and then by the time Vermeule came around, it had been forested again. Any place that was farmed in the Vermeule map that's now forest, we considered post-agricultural. And in the end, it was almost 50-50. It's about 40% and change of the forests in northern New Jersey here are post-agricultural forests, and the remainder is primary. When we did our studies looking at in a more comprehensive way at the vegetation in those forests, we also looked at other indicators of historical agricultural use that you can't see from satellites. So looking for, indications of like rock walls or microtopography or other, features that you could see at the ground level that also indicate historical agricultural use that might have preceded Vermeule. So that more intensive look with the vegetation analysis you see there on the right factored those things in. The GIS, like large scale analysis, didn't account for those potential discrepancies at the small scale, because it just wasn't feasible to do it across such a huge area of land. That answer your question? Okay, so if you would like the GIS layer, you can either contact Rick Lathrop or we can share it with you. Happy to.
Well, thank you all. Oh, yeah.
You were talking about things that people could do at home. And one of the things that you suggested was that folks who have a stream running through their property should avoid mowing right up to the edge of the stream. But how far back would you recommend that landowners keep their mower
As far as they're
from
willing.
infringing upon?
Yeah, I mean, really, the wider the better, you know, often often 300 feet is
300
kind
feet.
of like the standard that's given if you want to create an ordinance for a municipality. But that's pretty tough for some homeowners. So, you know, you'd have to go by property basis.
In the Sourlands, I have to say, we have a lot of homeowners who really are very conscientious about taking good care of the land. And answers like this are, I think, what a lot of people are lacking so that they can do the kinds of good that they really want to do. So hearing something like 300 feet, I think is critical for a lot of folks who aren't familiar with how important these riparian buffers are. And so we're trying to focus a lot of our efforts, thanks to NJCF and others who have helped us learn how to layer their Vermeil maps with the aerial photographs so that we can make up the difference between what's digitized and not in the Sourlands. We have been finding where those post-ag and primary forests are and concentrating our work there. But a lot of that land is privately owned, and some of it people are living there like me. And so when I learn things like I have wetland, you know, adjacent to my property, I want to take good care of that. But when I moved in, I had no idea how to do that. So I'm learning a lot, and we hope that our followers are learning a lot too.
The best practice documents that I've seen, for example, like the guidelines for forestry practices. If you're engaging in forestry activities and you're logging trees, the minimum buffer you want to leave is 50 feet, I believe.
Yeah.
But that's to avoid worst case scenarios. So if you really want to help the stream, you go more than that. And so if you look at standards for riparian buffers along streams that have some sort of classification, like C1 streams, it would go up to 300 feet. And intermediates are typically about 150 feet. So you could think of those as kind of benchmarks possibly for a minimum to kind of intermediate and best practice level is one approach. And that's from the top of the stream bank, not from the stream itself.
Right.
I had a question that occurred to me apropos of nothing. So a lot of people want to have access to water. Are there any best practices? Because you can say mow 300 feet, but somebody still wants to get to the stream. Is there a way to provide the landowner with access in the least harmful way? Is there some design criteria for that? Is it like a curved path or something that doesn't, is it? So that's my question.
Yeah, to the buffers, I would, you know, the 300 feet is, I mean, that is the answer, right? Like the 300 feet is the number that from a regulatory standpoint, we try to assign to the most protected, you know, water bodies. And so that's, if you're looking at stream classification, C1 is about as good as it gets. Yeah, right. So you have to keep a 300 foot there, you know, unless the state wants to give a waiver, which they do. But yeah, I mean, 150 and 50 has been seen to be, you know, effective. Stroud Water Research Center has some really long-term multiple restoration projects along an entire watershed where a lot of it was ag land. The majority of the watershed's ag land. And so I mean, it's pretty easy to find if you go to their website, and a lot of it shows some of the impacts. And yeah, it is, a lot of it does come down to long term, you know, like we're not seeing the real impacts for some things until 20 years later, but yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, in my opinion, is the epitome of stewardship, right? So, and we try to plan that into projects that we're doing. So even if we're removing a dam or doing restoration, we try to, if you're very intentional about it and use the best science and practices we know to say like, okay, we create the access there, but also use that as an example, as a leverage that in order to raise awareness and point out the strategy we've put in there to protect the area. And you know yeah, we have a path here and you can get into the water here, but did you notice you had to go through 300 feet of forest before you got there? Yeah.
Find criteria that are, there's obviously a straight path you're gonna.
Don't go straight
Yeah.
past. Straight.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, natural materials.
Good question.
I have another one. It'd be better to plant a meadow on a current turf site and let natural succession take place, or rather than plant trees in tubes? Like just put a,
This is a you question.
sorry, I'm.
What was it again? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Would it be better to plant a managed meadow on a current turf site and let natural succession take place rather than plant trees in tubes?
Both, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they're mutually exclusive options necessarily. And it also is going to depend on the context. Like if you are talking about a mowed area, maybe like along a stream corridor, like we were just referring to, if there's a forest right next to it, you're probably going to get a lot of natural seed rain happening in that turf grass. That's going to help you get to your goal. If you're in the middle of Newark and you're lucky enough to have a patch of grass and you want to turn that into a forest, you're not going to have the same kind of seed inputs naturally occurring in those places. Or if you do, it might not be species that you want. So, it's really up to the people doing the work to decide based on the context, based on their resource limitations and so forth, and all kinds of other factors, what's going to be the most effective and feasible and appropriate approach to turning turf grass into a forest ultimately. So it's hard to say without knowing what those factors are in like a global or general sense. The answer is it depends.
Yeah. They also ask if it's better to plant fewer and larger trees than more saplings.
The most important thing is if you're going to plant trees, to plant them properly, because that's the quickest way to kill a tree is to not plant it. And we've seen lots of examples of that. And that's a constant challenge when you're working with volunteer groups of various ages and skill levels and so forth, which is typically how these things are done. So there's trade-offs. When you get large trees, they've got major advantages going for them, but they've also been kind of captive in their root balls for a long amount of time, and that can also impair survival and growth in the long run. So again, it depends, is the only answer I can give.
Can you take 30 seconds and define the word properly in the context?
I can put you in touch with the arborist that can tell you the details, but making sure that the tree is roughly planted level with the ground, not below the ground, not above the ground, that you don't make mulch volcanoes above it because that causes the tree to put roots out into the mulch volcano, and then those roots freeze to death in the wintertime and you're exposing the tree to greater harm. So simple things like making it level can go a long way, making sure roots aren't exposed and they're also not buried too deep. That's a good place to start.
It's still rocky, so even just when we plant fruit trees, we've turned up a lot of the soil with the hope that you give the roots a chance to actually expand, versus just hitting rock after rock.
Yeah, and especially when it's a post-ag situation, there might not be any organic matter left in the soil, and so adding organic matter, compost or mulch or something can go a long way to improving survival.
But in those cases, you might be just like if it's a healthier soil, you don't want to disturb it as much, right? You want to let the roots kind of find their way around the rocks.
Right.
So again, it depends.
It's the answer nobody wants to hear, but it's
Yeah.
usually the answer in ecology is it depends.
Just have a question about your study design. Oh, your study design in relation to your question. Are you looking at like point source pollution in each of the two different forests? Or are you looking at how well those forests clean the water?
Yeah, I mean, when you're measuring nitrate content or nutrient concentrations in streams that are running through forested areas, you're really looking at non-point source pollution for the most part. And actually, you know, in the intact forest, what I'm measuring really is just baseline. That is what natural ecosystems are producing.
So the water though isn't originating in either of those forests. So are you sampling upstream and downstream of the forest in addition to within the forest?
Now, these are small watersheds, so these are really small catchments. For the most part, they're mostly forested.
Okay.
Otto's Farm is a little bit of an outlier because there's still essentially old fields that are in the process of reforesting.
Okay.
Yeah, but that is one of the challenges of doing stream work is that you're basically looking at the collective impact across your entire watershed. But if you go, these were all first order streams, right? So they're draining really small areas of land.
Okay.
So that's how I get a little bit more control.
We're at.
I was pointing at me.
Improving tubes, maybe it's been 5 years, 6 years, something like that.
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
that's a whole, like, people are trying to figure out what's the best way to do that
Right.
and
When to do it. Yeah.
how to do it, and do we still have to cage things to
Do you have two tank cages?
mainly we have tubes. Yeah, because I mean, it's cheapest to do it that way. It's really expensive to do the cages in the amount that you would have to
Right.
do.
Yeah, we're gonna. Boards preparation, so Rob will be here in the hot seat, Rob Allen, the stewardship director, and you can ask him all those board questions.
Very good.
I would just say that maybe I can send it to you, or you can distribute it, but Stroud did a study of this. And they experimented with taking off tubes at certain heights and different lengths, and so it's very interesting. So I'll send it. Maybe Laurie can share it.
So I should have said at the outset, I had met Jay briefly when I was at the Sourland Conservancy before I became the executive director, but I took the ED role in the fall of 2019. And in March of actually in the fall, Bill Zipsey from the Forest Service came and spoke with us, and he warned us that the ash borer was coming. And I asked him at that talk, how many trees are we talking about? What's the composition of ash trees in the Sourland Forest? I had no idea. And he got back to me in March of 2020 when I had set up my desk in my front hall. And my whole staff was working at home, and we had just gotten the news of, lockdown. We had to go home. And so I'm just trying to get my feet underneath me as a new ED. And I got this news from Bill Zipsey that 1.1 million ash trees were dying in the Sourlands. And I freaked out a little bit, and I called Jay. And I said, Jay, do you remember me? I mean, we've met like maybe once or twice, but I have this new job and I'm trying to save the Sourlands. And I just heard that 1/5 of the trees are dying. Can you help me figure out what to do? Do we plant trees? Do we install exclosures? What should we do? And Jay said, it depends. And so I still have the notes. I had a big legal pad and I was just writing and flipping and writing and flipping. And he gave me all kinds of ideas and folks that I needed to talk to and a long list of experts. And then I just started making phone calls because I didn't have anything to do. And so I called Emil DeVito and I called Mike Van Cleef and I called a lot of folks who knew a lot more about forest restoration than I will ever know. And they've really helped us answer questions like the ones that you guys have been asking tonight. Should you plant trees at all? Should you plant trees in tubes? Should you plant a meadow and then trees? Should you plant shrubs? What kind of trees should you plant? Where should you plant them? How should you plant them? What size should you plant? Where should you get them from? And we have learned a lot, and Rob will be here and he will answer a lot of those questions for you. But the short answer is it depends. It depends on the landowner because we don't own any land. It depends on the landowner's goals for their land. It depends on how that land has been used. It depends on what our hopes are for that property. So we can say we'd like to have 350 feet of riparian buffer. And honestly, we have been focusing a lot on riparian buffer because planting 1 million trees in the Sourlands is not something that we can do today or tomorrow. So we thought, where are the priorities? And fortunately, the watershed has told us that, you know, a priority could be riparian buffer because the Sourlands has, in our estimation, about 350 miles of inadequate riparian buffer. 90 square mile Sourland Mountain region has 350 miles of inadequate riparian buffer. Now, I'm a young woman, but even if I start planting today, riparian buffer, and I just focus on planting riparian buffer today, tomorrow, and the day after that, that's a lot of years of planting riparian buffer. So if we only plant riparian buffer, we'll be very busy for a long time. But the folks that we're partnering with also have hay fields that they like to convert to forest. And we have put up a fence and planted inside the fence, and I'm sure that it did a great job regenerating within the fence. It looks good to me, but it, again, doesn't look as good as the primary forest next door where we've put up deer fence. So that says to me, or just reinforces to me, one of the things that Jay told me on that very first call was that if deer overpopulation was not a problem in the Sourlands, this forest would be able to regenerate itself in a lot of areas. So not everywhere. It would still need a human hand. And fortunately, we've got a lot of humans and a lot of hands. So the good news is there are a lot of people here, and the good things that we can do are a lot. It's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of money. And those big trees cost a lot of money. Digging big holes to put big trees costs a lot of money. You can plant a lot of small trees that could grow a lot easier in this rocky Sourland soil by the time you buy one large tree and dig a really big hole. And again, you don't know what the mortality of that great big tree is going to be. So if you put all your eggs in that basket may fall. But if that basket is located in your front yard, you may want to restore your front yard. You may want to replace that dead ash tree in your front yard with a really large anything else that's native, because you need that shade. I mean, in my yard, we lost almost all of our trees, which were solid ash. And so everything below those trees, all the ferns and all the understory trees that were relying on that shade died in my yard. And I have replaced a lot of that with meadow, and I am doing a little bit of successional planting in my own yard by starting with meadow, but it's not really practical in a lot of situations. So again, the answer is what to do in any specific spot depends. So when Rob comes, You can talk to him about all your own scenarios. We'll all be, I think he's watching at home. Hi, Rob. You can bring your questions and he will happily answer them. But I just appreciate the fact that you're all here and that you're all really interested and you're all really passionate about saving the Sourlands, because that gives me a lot of hope. And I hope that that carries us all through a very, very difficult time. Putting a tree in the ground is a really, really hopeful gesture, and it makes me feel really good when I do it. And if you do it right, that tree could thrive. A lot of the trees that we've been planting are starting to get to the point where they're over the tops of the tubes, sometimes even over our heads. And when I'm thinking about restoring the forest, I think about generations from now. What's it going to be like for my kids? What are my grandkids? What's their experience in the Sourlands going to be? But honestly, I can clearly see that this week I can walk out to Moore's Creek or Otto's, and I can see the work that we've done. Thanks to Roots for Rivers, the Watershed, Nature Conservancy, and all of our partners, those trees are growing over my head. They're producing fruit. Birds are coming through here and eating native fruit because of the work that we have all been doing collectively. It is very restorative to the Sourlands and to us. So thank you all for all of the work that you've been doing. Thank you to the Watershed, thanks to RBCC, thanks to all of our partners, and thanks to all of our volunteers and our hardworking interns, some of whom are in the back. Thank you, because this is how we're going to save the Sourlands.
Rob, the 16th, like 2 weeks from today.
October 16th. Thanks.
Um,